I'm Jillian York, and I'm the author of Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. Imagine a society where the laws are created behind closed doors without public input or approval. This is a society where at any time the laws are subject to change or be replaced with new ones altogether. There is no democratic participation, no transparency, and no due process, and the laws are enforced by minimally trained workers in faraway locales who often lack awareness of local conditions or increasingly by trained machines. Now, this is a fictional society, but to me, it represents something. It represents what goes on behind closed doors in Silicon Valley, where the majority of the platforms that we use today online were created and are operated from. I first got interested in this subject almost 20 years ago when I first moved to Morocco, and I quickly learned that livejournal.com was blocked. Now, coming from the US, I hadn't really experienced much censorship, but arriving in Morocco found that the government blocked a number of different websites that crossed the country's red lines. These are things like criticism of the royal family and of the government, and discussion about the Western Sahara. I learned that it wasn't just LiveJournal that was blocked, but a number of different websites, including those that documented potential human rights violations in the country. And over the time that I lived there were also lots of offline acts of censorship as well. In 2007, the last year that I lived there, a young man named Fouad Mortada crossed one of those red lines when he created a page that was impersonating, or at least parodying, one of the members of the royal family. He was arrested for doing so, and Facebook, where the page had been hosted, took down that page. It's not clear whether they did so because the government asked them to, or because it violated their own rules. But that got me really interested in the subject. And a year later, when I moved to Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, I began to work on a project called the Open Net Initiative, where we looked at internet filtering, which is the blocking or otherwise restricting of content online, by more than 65 countries. There I learned that internet censorship or filtering was widespread, and that the lines that Morocco put into place were actually quite common around the world. Things like religion, politics, but also sexually explicit content, hate speech, and a number of other things were routinely censored by dozens of countries. While I was at that job, I got an email from a young man in Morocco who said that he had been censored by Facebook. Now, let me pause to just give a quick comment on the term censorship. While we usually think of censorship as something that's done by governments, and that is true when we're talking about legal forms of censorship, censorship is essentially the act of an authority asserting its dominance and its values over the public by imposing regulations, punishments, or other measures on expression to which it objects. This is the definition of censorship that I use throughout the book and which I prefer. And what I mean is that it isn't just states that can enact this sort of authority or assertion of dominance, but rather other institutions, religious and cultural institutions, educational ones, and increasingly online platforms owned by companies. This instance of this young Moroccan who got in touch with me, he had been administering a page calling for the separation of religion and education, and his page was removed by Facebook. This story prompted me to begin writing a report called Policing Content in the Quasi-Public Sphere. And through this process, I learned that US platforms were subject to the First Amendment as well, which enabled them to curate or censor content as they see fit. And so they're also exercising their free speech when they decide what they want on their very platforms. I began to study the phenomenon, and I found all sorts of examples of content removals that to me seemed wrong. From the banning on Facebook of a woman whose name didn't quite fit their idea of what a name should be, to a photograph taken in Romania that documented a young boy smoking. That one was removed by Flickr. To YouTube taking down content that depicted police brutality. To me, many of these decisions seemed arbitrary at best. Now, a lot of my research in the beginning was naturally focused on the Middle East and North Africa because that was where I'd lived and studied and had a large network. And so naturally, when the Tunisian uprising began, followed by the Egyptian one, I was paying attention. The first several chapters of my book cover this era, looking at how social media was revolutionary at the time and how it was used in the region, but also how it was censored both by states and how social media platforms censored users. Before I move on to the next section, I'll quickly share two stories that I think are really emblematic of this time. The first one is the story of the journalist Wael Abbas, a young journalist at the time who uploaded a video depicting graphic police brutality to YouTube and had his account blocked for doing so. Now, this case is really interesting because it was an early case. It happened in 2007. And as I would learn during the research for my book, it was actually quite controversial internally at YouTube. It involved a number of different lawyers at YouTube and the parent company Google who had to decide whether the fact that this video depicted a potential human rights violation would supersede the fact that it also depicted graphic violence. In the end, Wael Abbas got his account back, but the video was not put back up. Another example is that of a famous page that was created in the summer of 2010 following the police murder of Khaled Said, a young man in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, this page was called We Are All Khaled Said, and it would later become very famous for calling for the January 25th uprising in across Egypt. But just a few months before, in November of 2010, that page was removed because its administrator was using a pseudonym. He wasn't using his real name, and as such, he was violating Facebook's policies. Now, this was early on in the company's lifespan, and so because of that, they were more engaged with civil society at the time, and a group of members from civil society were able to get in touch with executives at the company to restore the page. Now, I think about that case often because if that page hadn't been restored, the course of history might be different. And so for me, these stories, as well as several others that I tell in those first few chapters, are really important for demonstrating how these platforms play an outsized role in our political dialogue. Political activism is one of my topics of interest, but another is the censorship of nudity and sexual content across these platforms. I first became interested in this as an online phenomenon when observing that most social media platforms prohibited the display of women's breasts. In its early days, Facebook didn't allow any display of breasts, whether we're talking about a breastfeeding mother or someone from a culture where that was the norm. In fact, they said that they banned naked private parts, including female nipple bulges and naked butt cracks, but that male nipples were okay. And we'll come back to that in just a moment with a story. They also said back then, and similarly now, that they restricted the display of nudity because some audiences within their global community may be sensitive to this type of content, particularly because of their cultural background or age. Let me pause on that for just a minute. Particularly because of their cultural background or age. What this to me represents is that executives in Silicon Valley are making decisions for what can be displayed because of what they think other people, presumably elsewhere in the world, would want to see. I find this deeply troubling. And so I became involved in the ongoing fight to change these policies alongside various campaigns, including the famous Free the Nipple campaign, that have been successful in pushing the boundaries a bit. But still today, many policies exist that inhibit both nude and sexual expression. For instance, while some platforms like Facebook now do allow women's breasts when they're breastfeeding, or in cases such as artistic content or an instance of traditional cultural performance, most continue to discriminate on the basis of gender, allowing men to be shirtless at any time, while women and non-binary bodies cannot be. I believe that these policies inherently sexualize women and non-binary people, and that this, of course, has an outsized impact on artistic expression. Now, let me share a couple favorite examples. This is a famous New Yorker cartoon. It depicts Adam and Eve underneath an apple tree, commenting on the biblical concept of original sin. The caption says, well, it was original. Now, I thought that this was hilarious, and so did the New Yorker, but Facebook not so much. When this was uploaded to Facebook, they determined that it violated the policies against women's breasts. The New Yorker, of course, has lots of resources, and so they created a new version of the cartoon to see what would happen. This one depicts Adam and Eve fully clothed, but with the same apple tree and the same caption. The New Yorker also blogged about this, noting that while Adam and Eve's nipples were both showing, it was in fact Eve's nipples that likely violated the policy. So again, men can be shirtless, women cannot, even when they're cartoons. These and other instances did bring a bit of shame on these companies and led to the expansion of some of their policies, but the policies are still evenly applied, and their application is left to the whims of content moderators who respond to reports from users. So here are a couple more examples. Michelangelo's David, a famous statue that was historically censored in Italy, in Florence, with a fig leaf, but is now shown in its original nude form inside of a gallery in Florence. It's typically allowed on the platform, possibly because it's so famous. But another example, Gustave Courbet's L'Origine du Monde, which I've censored here, has been deemed too obscene for the platform, despite it being a renowned piece of art. Of course, while these can be seen in galleries and on websites all over the world and are pretty famous and probably will not be forgotten in history, other amateur and contemporary artists typically fare the worst on these platforms. Here's an example. It doesn't actually contain nudity or sexual content, but rather menstruation. This is by famous poet and artist Rupi Kaur, who uploaded a series of photographs to Instagram that she had taken to try to break some of the taboos around menstruation. She found that they were censored by the platform pretty quickly. And yet at the same time, very famous celebrities are often given exceptions. Here's one of Kim Kardashian. This was uploaded by Paper Magazine to Facebook, and it was allowed despite the fact that it clearly violates the platform's policies. And so whereas a fig leaf used in historic times merely covers up a portion of a nude artwork, modern digital censorship, and I would say particularly when it's applied to amateur artists or lesser known artists, removes all traces of that artwork. The art is in fact disappeared. Of course, it isn't just artists who are impacted by these policies. One of the great real-life examples that I discuss in my book is that of Courtney Damone, a transgender woman who, as she was transitioning, posted photographs to Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, documenting her transition, to discover at what point the platform would deem her breasts to be too female to be shown. "We did a photo shoot," said Courtney, and wrote a Mashable article, and then I kept on posting as regularly as possible to see what would happen. It didn't last that long. It was about 2 or 3 months, and then Instagram and Facebook decided to pull everything, including the earliest ones before I'd started hormone therapy and didn't have any breast development. They just pulled it all down. Courtney continued, one of the goals of her photos was not to be sexualized, and yet all of the photos got taken down as the project went on. As I wrote in my book's 6th chapter, the fact is that the policies of many Silicon Valley companies, including Facebook, remain reflective of large swaths of US culture, particularly those of the loudest voices. Facebook and Google, for example, their staff might therefore argue that they too are just following existing cultural standards. But that begs the question, whose cultural standards exactly demand that women be covered? And that's one of the biggest questions throughout the book, whether we're talking about women and their bodies or the concept of terrorism. A lot of different content is impacted by these policies, including educational information. A book about vaginas was repeatedly banned by Facebook, as well as an advertisement for a company that helped women find better fitting bras. As you might imagine, the policies, practices, and rules impacting explicit sexual content, as well as the producers of such content, are even more stringent. They've become even more so since the passing of a law in the United States in 2018 called Sesta Fosta. This law was intended to curb sex trafficking, but has additionally had a chilling effect on all forms of sexual and nude online expression. Because there's a culture of fear around this law, companies often over-restrict content that they deem to be too sexual, including things like athletic and artistic pole dancing and burlesque. There's also evidence that sex workers have been removed from platforms even when they weren't actively engaging in sexual expression on them for fear of abetting illegal activity. Of course, while these platforms are mostly American, their user base is global, and sex work isn't illegal everywhere. This means that individuals who are doing their legal jobs in places like Germany also feel the chill of US censorship. And this brings me back to the main thesis of the book, which is that the decisions made in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, as well as the halls of Washington, D.C., have an outsized influence on expression all over the world, imposing US cultural values on people everywhere. And that marginalized and vulnerable communities, including activists, women, LGBTQ people, artists, and many others, including all forms of intersecting identities, are those most affected by these policies. The proponents of these policies are perhaps too deeply embedded in their own regressive worldview to see the breadth of the harm that they're perpetrating. And that's why I believe that it's imperative to claim space so that people of color, queer and trans individuals, women, people with disabilities, artists, and all other manner of marginalized individuals can have a seat at the table. That's what I argue in this book, that platforms in Silicon Valley, as well as around the world, need to be considering who their base is and not imposing their own worldview on us. They need to bring civil society to the table and be transparent about their policies, both to their users and to the public, as well as allow users to have access to remedy or due process when poor decisions are made. Now, of course, there's an increasing number of terrifying issues occurring on these platforms as well, such as incitement, other hateful speech, terrorism, etc. And so these platforms also have a responsibility to make sure that they're doing their due diligence in ensuring that they're complying with international human rights frameworks. But at the same time, I think that it's really important that we consider, not just the harms that occur on these platforms, as many have been doing, but also the harms that occur when platforms remove important expression from them. And so that's what my book is about, the ways in which Silicon Valley platforms have this impact on our speech and what we can do about it, because I believe that the future is yet to be written and that we can all play a part. Thank you.
So hi, Jillian.
Hello.
First of all, thank you for being part of this series of book talks about constraints on sexual expression. And also thank you for your long-time research and activism on issues of free speech and for your wide-ranging book based on this experience.
Thank you.
So in the book, you make a strong argument about social media platforms as a quasi-public sphere, imposing arbitrary and overbroad censorship on billions of users without civil society supervision or transparency. Mm-hmm. You also point at the ability of governments to make kind of backdoor deals with the companies operating these platforms and imposing censorship which they, as governments, cannot accomplish directly because of constitutional and human rights concerns. So given the global scale of the most broadly used social media platforms, censorship on them has very far-reaching consequences. They play an important role in our political environment and have an effect on how we treat a range of cultural issues, more importantly to our conversation today, nudity and sexuality. Mm. As you argue, social media platforms impose a set of values about nudity and sexuality based not even on the values of the group of Silicon Valley policymakers setting them, but of their imagination of a sensitive other. And these are norms that discriminate on the basis of gender, they sexualize women's bodies, and they subject art, sex education, and a whole bunch of other issues to the whims of content moderators. Mm. So in our conversation today, I'd like to talk a little about how we got here, what the urgent current issues are, and how we go forward from here. Great. So first of all, it's a lot, but let's see. Why are the largest social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube so nudity and sex averse? Who makes content policy? Whose standards do they follow? Surely not the standards of US culture as a whole, if there's even a whole of US culture, where we have all sorts of thriving sexual subcultures in spite of traditional Puritanism. So what is going on here?
Yeah, so I think that there's just such a range of factors, and I'll try to dig into as many of them as I can. I mean, first of all, we do have lots of thriving sexual subcultures in the United States today, but that even though that may have historically been the case as well, a lot of those were heavily suppressed, especially in, even in recent decades, probably right up until the 1960s, where we saw, a growing movement around openness and sexuality. But that being said, because of that history and because of the strain of conservative movements in the US of various religions, but I would say mostly of Christian backgrounds, there is in fact a rather conservative strain in the US as well. So I think that for context, I think that that's really helpful to remember that up until recently, even just a few decades ago, we saw the suppression of sexual lyrics on albums. This went right into the 80s and 90s with lyrics coming from hip hop and from other genres of music. We saw this with Elvis Presley. I think that's such a fantastic example that's currently featured in a new film where being reminded that again, just a handful of decades ago when my parents were fairly young, Elvis was close to being held liable for the way he danced on stage, just a handful of
swaying hips.
Exactly, the swaying hips. And so there are these contrasts in the United States. There's a historic openness. We have, a great tradition of freedom of expression, but that expression has not always been truly free, especially when it comes to sexual content and obscenity. And so if we look, I think that we can look at some legal factors here, some of the prohibitions that exist around obscenity. And I should say for the viewers that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to speak about this in broad terms. But we also have a history of really reactionary responses to the growth of pornography, both offline and online. So in the 1970s with Hustler magazine and the cases against Larry Flynt, in more recent years with and I know we'll get to this, so I won't get into it too much in detail, but with the Communications Decency Act and the attempt to ban pornography on the internet. And then more recently, just in 2018, with the passing of SESTA FOSTA, which was intended primarily to curb sex trafficking, but has had a huge negative impact on all sorts of sexual content, just from anything from sex worker organizing to the ordinary activities of people engaged in sex work online, as well as nudity and other expressive content on platforms such as Tumblr. So I think the why is a combination of factors that, despite the flourishing of certain subcultures in the US, and even maybe the flourishing of sexualized expression in certain musical genres and other things, there's still, I think those, all of those various communities are still coming up against a broader piece of culture that wants to suppress that speech, often for the sake of the children, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like going into different extremes and going from a period of liberalization to a period of clamping down. And to sort of follow up on some of this, I'd like to speak more about both the Communications Decency Act and SESTA FOSTA. So can you talk more about the porn panic that happened in the 90s around the internet and the sudden explosion of accessible porn, and the Communications Decency Act that followed that, and how and why the Communications Decency Act failed?
Sure. So I was quite young at the time. So I'm telling this from research and not from recollection, although I do remember some of these pieces. So what I will say is that in my childhood, in the I'd say the 80s and early 90s, it wasn't that easy for a child in the US to stumble across pornography. You might stumble upon a stack of Playboy magazines in the basement, as I may have. You might have seen it, at a friend's house, maybe on pay-per-view television. But it was pretty rare to actually see porn unless you went looking for it or someone gave it to you. That all changed with the internet. And so in the 1990s, as pornographic images began to flow across the web, enabling really anybody with an internet connection to access them on news groups and other places online, the internet, I think people like pornography, people like sexual content. And so the internet enabled them to seek it out very readily. One of the things that I mentioned in my book that viewers might not be so aware of is that shortly after this musical came out on Broadway called Avenue Q that actually had a song called "The Internet is for Porn." And the whole song is about how the internet is for porn. And so this is sort of a widespread belief. Now, of course, you're going to have a reaction to that. And in 1995, Time magazine, famous magazine all over the world, had a cover that depicted a small child in front of a computer screen looking aghast with the word cyber porn under his chin in capital letters. And this to me was a very clear example of fear mongering. And in the article, it talked about a web study that allegedly found that pornography was rampant on news groups at the time. I believe the paper by Martin Rim, who was an undergraduate student, in fact, and had been published in the Georgetown Law Journal, his paper claimed that 80% of images on news groups at the time were pornographic in nature. So that caused quite a bit of alarm and led to a series of hearings where Senators Jim Exon of Nebraska and Slade Gordon of Washington, so a Democrat and a Republican in the US, both sides of the aisle, in 1995 proposed an amendment to the Telecommunications Act that would later become the Communications Decency Act. And that would have extended existing indecency and anti-obscenity laws that had already been in place in the US to the internet explicitly. And what was the basis of their proposal? This study by an undergraduate student that had been published in this law review. But the thing about that study was that it wasn't entirely true. And in fact, the New York Times dismissed the paper, said that it was sloppy, misleading, all sorts of things like that. But nevertheless, it had already had this impact. And so the Communications Decency Act was first put into place and then later revoked. That piece of it was revoked. But the remaining part that stayed, so the anti-obscenity provisions left, but the remaining part that stayed was Section 230, which is why we call it Section 230, even though it's a standalone law, which does protect companies from liability. So we got a good piece out of that, the Communications Decency Act. But to me, that story is really interesting because of how it in just this simple paper, this simple false study, disinformation really, or misinformation perhaps, enabled these senators to create this series of hearings that then led to the creation of a really problematic law that thankfully is no longer in place.
And the law failed, not so much because of the research being false, but because you couldn't limit what adults see because of children, and there are also more easier ways and ways that were more constitutionally sound to limit what comes to children, like
exactly,
filtering.
yeah. To clarify, the law faced a lot of challenges after it was put into place and was then thus revoked. Yeah.
So Section 230. Section 230 is what we will owe the internet as we know it, because Section 230 is crucial to platforms being able to host all kind of speech, but at the same time moderating without having liability for what a third party has posted. And exactly. Section 230 is very much in the news today because it's being challenged. And can you talk a little about those challenges, SESTA FOSTA and others?
Yeah, so SESTA FOSTA is one of the bigger or more recent big carve-outs to Section 230. And so there's a lot of background that led up to SESTA FOSTA. One of basically one of the major things that had happened in the years prior to that was that Backpage, which was a website that enabled sex workers to use the internet to find clients, et cetera, that the government essentially went after Backpage. And I'm glossing over some details because I don't remember them off the top of my head. But nevertheless, there became a lot of fear-mongering in recent years around sex trafficking online, which is obviously is a thing and something that we should be concerned about. But the reaction to it was to create this carve-out that would in fact hold companies liable for hosting content that was deemed sex trafficking. The problem with that law, and the law is SESTA FOSTA because it was two different packages that ended up being smushed together from the Senate and the House. But those two laws that got put together essentially, like I said, companies can be held liable for sex trafficking on them. However, the law is vaguely worded, which basically means that it has a massive chilling effect on a wide range of sexual content, at least as we see it. It's not always clear whether companies are responding to requirements under the law or whether they're afraid of failing to enforce the law. And we see this in other areas as well when it comes to violent extremism, when it comes to US sanctions, material support laws. There's a whole other range of areas where companies fear being held liable for things like foreign terrorism. But in this case, it's exceptionally problematic because this is nearly always things that are in fact and should be considered free expression that are being categorized essentially as sex trafficking. So I think that this is a massive chilling effect, and we've seen the effect that it has had not just on US content, but also content all over the world because most of these companies are American.
So what type of content is being suppressed that should not be suppressed? Oh, I just wanted to, because we didn't mention the full names of those bills. SESTA is Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, and FOSTA is Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. It's everybody knows them as SESTA FOSTA, and the connection is with sex trafficking, but they're abbreviations. Yes, how do they? What, for example, do they chill in terms of
Sure.
speech?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of content. I would say starting at the top, a lot of conversations involving sex workers. So for instance, sex workers, and there are several sites that document various instances. I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but maybe we can put it in here. The various instances that have been documented that are, attributable essentially to this law. One example, sex workers have reported that Instagram has removed their accounts and images, even when they don't contain explicit content. So people who are just simply identifying in text as sex workers. There have been cases of Facebook discussion groups. One famous case that I was actually just discussing today is the case of Switter, which was it's meant to mimic Twitter. It was a Mastodon instance that was hosted, I don't recall who hosted it, but that's actually not the important piece. It was a Mastodon instance that was meant for Australian sex worker communities to be able to basically discuss with each other issues of safety, because it's obviously a dangerous job in many ways. And Cloudflare, which had provided certain services, I can't recall if it was DDoS services or other types of services, but it really doesn't matter. They had provided services to this platform and denied those services, attributing that in a statement to Sesta Fosta. And so we saw a case of an American company, again, denying services to a foreign platform functionally. But
and
there's
Cloudflare is a kind of infrastructural
yes,
service. It's not
yeah,
even a platform that moderates.
exactly. Yeah. So it's somewhere between a platform that moderates an infrastructure service. I would say it sits somewhere in the middle of the stack, let's say. But yeah, there are other trickle-down examples too that are much more surprising, I think, that are much farther away from anything that could be considered sex trafficking. So for example, Instagram has limited pole dancing, which is often an athletic activity, sometimes a more sexualized activity, but nevertheless, certainly does not constitute sex trafficking in any way. But that's something where hashtags have been limited and people's images have been limited. We've seen examples around Tumblr. Tumblr attributed their ban on nudity in 2018 or 19 to Sesta Fosta. They've now reversed some of that ban, but they still, it had a chilling effect on speech there and caused a pretty large exodus from Tumblr. And one of the interesting things about this is that it's also, companies have enabled a lot more automated technology to moderate sexual content. And so one of the things that we saw with Tumblr was not just a chilling effect on sexual content, but in fact, the automated technology that they were using was so bad that it was picking up a wide range of other expression as well, including things such as patents. So some really odd things got kind of caught in that net.
Yeah, actually, we have also witnessed on Instagram photographic artists that photograph the nude, and they properly censor their work. They cover the nipple, they blur genitals, so it passes Instagram's nudity terms of service. But they have started to be taken down because of sexual solicitation, because
Yes,
of
and
Sesta
I've actually
Fosta.
seen, I live in Berlin, and I've seen a large number of nightclubs change the way that they share photographs from their events. So in Berlin, it's quite common that people will have their tops off. People of all genders might have their tops off at a nightclub. It's not really controversial there. Might be in some other cities. But I've noticed that they've stopped posting images of women and non-binary people with their shirts off, probably out of fear of having their content removed or having their account banned entirely. And so you can see how this creates a real gender disparity, as well as, I see it as sort of discriminatory in the way that that people feel forced to apply it in terms of both the platforms and self-censorship.
Yeah, and there's so much fear that it affects a broad swaths of fully legal content. I think we have to mention that all this content is legal. None of it is sex trafficking, but it's being suppressed because it's easier because if you're a company that will be held liable for the content it is putting forth, why not suppress some of your artists or some of your sex workers rather than face liability? So
Exactly.
it becomes easier to go after these individual users. However, the price exacted from those users, losing their accounts, losing their audiences, losing their followers, is very high. Can you just clarify what Mastodon is for our audiences? Because you mentioned, and I'm sure not everybody is aware of Mastodon.
Sure. So Mastodon is a layer of a federated social network. So it runs on an underlying service called ActivityPub. But what Mastodon is essentially the front end of a social network that can be hosted. Okay, let me try that again. By federated, what I mean is that people can host different instances of Mastodon on different servers. And so while Mastodon itself is the front end, the platform, what you see online, what you use, there are different instances of Mastodon. So I might join the main one, which is hosted in Germany, or perhaps there's one that someone is hosting on their own server in Japan. And of course, because of this, because they're separately hosted, people can create different rules and different parameters around who their instance is for. However, the great thing about Mastodon is that all of these different Mastodon servers or services are interoperable. And so if I'm on the main server, I can still communicate with people who are using the Japanese server or the server that's just for sex workers or what have you. Kind of like email, really. I might use Gmail, you might use your work address, but we can still email with each other. It's similar to that.
Or perhaps like using Facebook, but having your Facebook post seen on Twitter. And is Mastodon a way to overcome this kind of the fact that that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter basically own us? There's no interoperability. You cannot take your data. You cannot take your friends. You cannot go anywhere. So you are basically subject to their terms of service, and there's nothing you can do about it but try to appeal, which hardly ever works. Would Mastodon be an actual, a real alternative to those people who's, who want to show nudity or who want to show nude photographs for sex workers? Would that be an alternative?
I would say yes and no. It depends on how. I mean, I think this kind of remains to be seen in a couple of ways. So on the one hand, Mastodon, other federated social networks enable you to have more control over your own data. You're not subject to the whims of a private company, but there is still content moderation because the server that you're on can still choose to moderate you. And that's the interesting thing about it, is that you're going to see a wide range of different types of content moderation on different Mastodon servers. So you could still lose your account and you could still not have any method of appealing. This is why I think that it's really important that as people move to these platforms, that civil society remains in dialogue with them so that federated social networks don't make the same mistakes that centralized ones have. But that being said, I think that the interoperability factor of them, the fact that you can port your own data, which is also a piece of interoperability, these are really excellent functions. And so I think the major issues that we're going to see play out over the next months to years are around freedom of expression on these platforms, because I would say that that's not guaranteed.
Right, but can you pick a server that has terms of service that you like?
Yes, you can.
For instance, prohibits hate speech, but allows nudity.
Yes, absolutely. And then I think the question comes is that server, are they using Cloudflare? Are they going to potentially be booted off by Cloudflare and then not able to survive? Are they using Amazon Web Services to host their, as a virtual server, a cloud server? Is Amazon going to kick off that server? And so there's a lot of questions here. But yes, in theory, if you had your own server, your own Mastodon server that you were hosting out of your house or your office or wherever, physical server, then you would have control over what's there. And so you could create the rules however you want them to, and you could have a Mastodon instance that is, very permissive around sexual content. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what do you think are the long-term effects of censoring porn and nudity, especially within a culture? American culture is we know celebrity culture, the Kim Kardashians, it's so over-sexualized. At the same time, you have this line around specifically nudity, even when and nudity is implicitly treated as always sexual. It isn't. There's breastfeeding, there's just, people walking nude on the beach, there's beautiful nude photographs. It's not always about sex. But it's a problem for people whose speech is suppressed, but is it also a problem for the culture at large?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I didn't really see pornography as a kid. And so my examples of the nude human body came from, maybe a handful of Playboy magazines and the people in the locker room at the swimming pool. But what I worry about is that as online content, as well as some offline content, has become more sexualized, more glossy, more photoshopped, what we're seeing are not realistic views of what people look like naked. And so as we're only seeing Kim Kardashian or Playboy models that have certain body types, perhaps plastic surgery, or perhaps are just photoshopped, we're getting a very skewed perception. And particularly young people who run into this content, again, online or offline, they're getting a skewed perception of what the human body looks like, but also of what sex looks like. And that's the concern I have with porn sites being widely accessible while nudity, average nudity and average sex are not accessible. I think that that's something that we should be concerned with. Is, I'm not saying ban porn. What I'm saying is we have to have a balanced array of content available online. But instead, what we have is mainstream or not mainstream, but sort of average, normal, standard sexual content is what or nude content as well, is what ends up being taken down and censored, while the pornography manages to somehow always find a way around and circumvent these prohibitions. And so we do get a very, very skewed perception. And I think that that's, yeah, of course, it's bad for the people who are publishing it, but it's also bad for youth. It's bad for the rest of us. It's bad. I think it's terrible when the only thing that young people are exposed to is the most extreme versions of whatever it is.
Yeah, and also people transitioning, working with the body are very much affected and marginalized, especially when you don't know at what point are you a man, at what point are you a woman, when does your nipple start presenting as a female nipple rather than as a male nipple.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't talk about in my talk, but that I think is something that really concerns me, is the fact that these platforms, despite professing a belief in non-binary gender, so Facebook, you have the option when you sign up for Facebook, for example, to choose from, I think, 50 something genders, which is fantastic, but you are seen as a woman if you have breasts of a certain size, regardless of what gender you are assigned at birth, and regardless of what gender you identify with. And that, to me, is really telling of what they really think about this. I think that's true of a lot of platforms as well, that if someone has breasts that look female, and I'm using big air quotes here because I think that that's an outdated idea of gender, but if that's what it looks like, then that's how the platforms treat you. And so we don't get a meaningful or realistic depiction of what non-binary people look like. We only get to see non-binary people who don't have breasts, and that's not really an accurate depiction. And of course, same with people who are transitioning as well.
And we actually had a case of somebody who was transitioning, who was taking a photograph, a male to female, and he was taking a photograph of the same body, the same photograph, with the head where the person looked male, and without the head where the breasts were appearing and they looked kind of female, and the breasts were taken down. That's in the same image. There were, the head helped, I guess, the algorithm identify the breast as male in the first instance.
Yeah, and I think we've also seen protests where women use cutouts of men's nipples to, as pasties, basically, to cover their nipples to see if they're seen as male. And both of these examples really demonstrate the absurdity of these determinations. And I think the sexualization of the top half of women's bodies is, a problem in itself, in addition to all of the rest of this.
Especially when, kind of living in New York, where it's legal for women to be topless. You can see there was a student at the School of Visual Art, and she would be going to school every day topless. And you can see that in the streets, and it's completely legal, but not on social media, and it's not sexual. So given the situation, I want in the next few minutes to talk a little bit about what to do. And I know we'll talk about civil society involvement, but first, for instance, if you were a policy person, what changes would you suggest to nudity and porn policies? And because I know there was a time when we were all more libertarian and wanted to have more of a rights environment where free speech could be the norm online, and everybody could speak freely, and there should be no moderation or minimal moderation. But now, and it's increasingly with COVID and with COVID-related misinformation, with election bots, with Russian interference in the elections, there is an increasing agreement that online speech should be regulated. So we've come to an understanding of that free speech rights, individual free speech rights, should be balanced against public interest and public health. So where do you stand on this, and how would you regulate if you're a policy person working at a large social media company? And given your broad critique and identification of failures in everything from principles, automation, human moderation, in an industry operating on an unprecedented scale, can content moderation be fixed?
Ooh, so many big questions. Well, so first, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to go back to that era of, let's not moderate platforms. I know that that's what we're watching kind of happen right now with the dialogue around Elon Musk and Twitter, but I don't think that's a realistic approach for a number of reasons. And I think part of that is really because we have a greater understanding now of the harms of certain types of disinformation, of certain types of hateful speech and incitement. That being said, I think we still need to go back to basics. And by basics in this case, I mean international human rights frameworks, because we do have a basis for determining what is truly harmful speech. Most governments agree on that. So that should have been our starting point when we were beginning to implement these rules. Yes, of course, there are some things that are potentially external to that, such as disinformation. I think that's a really difficult problem. But one thing that's notably not there is sexual content. So if I can stick to that for just a moment, and then I'll broaden the question back out. I don't think that anyone has made a compelling case for why nudity in particular has to be banned, but why most sexual content needs to be banned. I think that there are methods to use paywalls and other things to put hardcore pornography behind those doors so that adults can access them. I think a lot of those proposals are chilling. So the UK's proposal, for example, to have ISPs cut pornography off, I think that's really troubling. But I think if individual pornography platforms voluntarily put certain measures in place, I think that that's generally fairly reasonable. But let's put pornography to the side for a minute and say images, sexual images, nude images. I don't think that there's been a compelling case made for the harm of the majority of such images. And the fact is that those are the first things that platforms restricted in most cases. If you look.
One thing that Facebook has brought up with images of nudes is consent and age verification.
Yes.
So they're saying if somebody is a nude and somebody, your boyfriend is posting a revenge porn image of you nude, how do you know that there is consent? And how do you know that this is not a minor?
No, that's a very good point. That's very true. And I think that that's, the determining who is and is not a minor is a difficult question for these platforms. But I think that their response to all of these problems, and these are all very real problems, so I definitely don't want to minimize them. I did not intend to do so. But these are very real problems. However, the answer to that is not, let's ban it all, let's be lazy about it. There are so many different measures that platforms could have considered before they just wiped the internet of all of these things. And the fact is that porn sites also have all of these problems as well, but they've found ways to tackle it. They have, checked IDs of people who are, not in every case, there are obviously some problematic porn sites out there as well, but the major tube sites do some sort of age verification, and that is possible. Again, I don't believe that it should be at the government level, but I do think that these platforms could voluntarily choose to allow nudity under certain circumstances. They could certainly allow drawings and paintings and other things of nudity, which they don't always allow. And so there's a lot of leeway in between let's allow everything and let's ban almost everything. And right now we're over on the banning almost everything side. And so I guess what I would do if I were the policymaker at these companies is go back and put more granularity in those rules. I would stop using automation for every instance. I would think really hard about the question of age verification, because I do think that there are ways to get that right, or at least more right than they are right now. And I would also, certainly consider this issue around gender and the gender binary. That said, again, I think we need to separate nudity from sexual content, because yes, there are concerns around minors being nude online, certainly, but not all nude content is sexual, and I think that that's a division that needs to be made as well. To go back to the bigger question around whether content moderation is possible at scale, I still believe that good content moderation is not possible at scale. I still believe that these companies should go back and audit all of their policies and processes. And, because right now they're sort of built on top of each other, layers like an onion that have been built over the years. But another thing that I think we haven't really mentioned that's really important, as you know, is that these companies can be a lot more transparent about what they're doing, both to the public and to their users. So they can tell their users when they're taking something down. They can give users the option to appeal. And you could say implement that with around nude and sexual content by allowing them to appeal with age verification, for example. And that can still be the user's choice. So there's so many different ways that they could implement this, but I think these are all starting points. And right now, the point that we're at is that most companies are just slapping automation on it and calling it a day and not really looking carefully at what they're doing and the impact that it's having on various populations.
And of course, there's shadow banning, which is not even removing content that is banned by the terms of service. It's down-ranking content and disappearing content, basically, which is objectionable by some vague standard, and there's no notification and no possibility of appeal in those cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I like one thing you said that I really agree with as a free speech worker, that free speech is not always great. We don't say that free speech is wonderful, but that the harm of censorship is worse than the harms of speech. And I think that's very important to remember in this conversation, that we're not celebrating every speech, that there's speech that, words have effects. That's why they're so important. But censorship and the kind of giving the power to determine a global conversation to private companies is really so much more dangerous than having a nude being seen by somebody that doesn't want it, or even speech that is hateful, which is another issue, and how you determine what is hate speech and what is not. We're giving a kind of legal power to companies that have no responsibility and that they're not a court of law.
Exactly. Not only are they not a court of law, have no responsibility, but they also fail to take into account, they often fail to take into account when the government making the demands on them is authoritarian, or whether, a certain piece of content in a certain context is hateful, or whether it's, someone speaking back, or speaking using parody, or even when something is journalistic research. And so, yeah, there's so many examples of overbroad censorship that these companies engage in.
Yeah, and so civil society. So how would you engage? Is the Facebook Oversight Board a kind of engagement of civil society? How do you also make sure that civil society does not impose its own prejudices? How do you see civil society oversight working positively
Sure. So to
within
start
a
with
human rights framework?
Yeah. So to start with the Facebook Oversight Board, just because that's maybe even the easier question somehow in the bigger question. I think that the Facebook Oversight Board is not the answer, but I still think it's a worthwhile experiment. We should absolutely criticize it, as I have. But one of the things that I found really interesting about it is the way in which its variety of, relatively diverse, not diverse enough in my perception, but relatively diverse members have put out some pretty interesting recommendations and reports for Facebook on these cases. And I have actually agreed with every decision that they've made so far, which surprised me, maybe with the exception of one, I think. So they're looking at it, they're looking at these cases, applying international human rights standards and frameworks to them, and then putting out recommendations that then the company has to abide by. There are plenty of things to criticize. I think that they haven't done enough cases, given how many people they are and how much time they've had to do so. But I think it's worth looking at as a potential example or precedent that other companies, or even a multitude of companies, could implement. So that's the first part of that. The second part of the question was, Civil society, yes. Okay, so what can civil society do? So, I mean, I think that that's one part of it, but I think that ultimately, I mean, since a big piece of your question was around how do we make sure that civil society doesn't become, doesn't bring its own biases? I mean, I think that that's by having a wide global range of members of civil society, but not just geographically diverse, but also diverse across a range of issues. So I think we have to bring artists to the table. We have to bring LGBTQ groups to the table. We have to bring, environmental activists to the table. I think that the problem with a lot of traditional civil society, and the reason that we're kind of seeing this, or at least one of the reasons we're seeing this cultural clash around freedom of expression right now, and different pushes from different communities over what these platforms should do, is that historically the only groups that were really paying attention to these issues were free speech organizations. And that's for a number of reasons. I'm certainly not blaming other organizations for not coming to the table sooner. They had plenty of other things to work on. But the fact is, many of them arrived late, and we were all surprised to hear that, in fact, perhaps they were not in favor of this same libertarian idea of free expression that many early digital rights groups were. And so I think that if we all work together, we can find some sort of common ground on a lot of these issues, and help and learn from each other, which is what I think is so great about fora like the Internet Governance Forum, which is happening right now.
So, so the organization of these structures would be independent of both government and social media companies.
I think that there's
self-organizing.
Yeah, I think that there's a few different ways to do it. I mean, the multi-stakeholder model, such as the Internet Governance Forum and ICANN and all of these things, has been tried and is successful for bringing a lot of people to the table and having these conversations. But I also think that, given the realities of how these companies operate in the world, I do think that we should have more fora, but more discussion fora between the companies and civil society directly, without governments at the table. Because a lot of times what we're seeing is that these governments are engaging in the same things that they're trying to ban, right? And so you have governments that are looking to ban disinformation that are simultaneously in certain ways engaging in disinformation, right, or at least politicians from the same countries are. And so I worry that when you bring governments to the table, that they're always going to have the upper hand over civil society, and that we do not, in fact, get the same privileges. I mean, we're seeing this even at the IGF right now, which, as much as I think it's a good thing, VIPs, which includes governments, were allowed to bring their mobile phones into the forum while civil society wasn't. So we're already seen as unequal. And so I think that given the power that these companies hold, it's important that they bring civil society to the table as well. Of course, I also think that there's dialogue that needs to happen between lawmakers in democracies and civil society as well. That's not always happening. Sesta Fosta paid a lot of attention to a handful of lobbying celebrities and sex trafficking groups, but they didn't listen to digital rights groups, the people who created it, sorry. The Network Enforcement Act in Germany didn't really bring civil society to the table. And there were a lot of flaws in that law that could have been pointed out much sooner than they actually were, had we been a part of that dialogue. And so I think all of these different angles are important.
Yeah, well, thank you. This was really informative. And to end, I would like you to talk a little about, you say you remain optimistic. And I think, we've heard a little bit of that optimism in your enthusiasm about civil society structures. But on the basis of what do you remain optimistic in terms of what is happening today?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I've been struggling to be optimistic recently with what's going on with Twitter. It's been very heartbreaking from my perspective as somebody who kind of grew up on that platform. But at the same time, I mean, the fact that there's been this exodus to Mastodon, we're seeing new platforms being created in the wake of Twitter, that there's all sorts of innovation happening because of the disappointment in what's going on there. That does give me some optimism. With global civil society, I think really where that optimism comes from is that I came to these issues at a time when I was often one of the only women in the room, often only one of the people under 30, not anymore, but back then, in the room, sorry, and where there were very few people from other countries or, other like various categories in the room. And so a lot of marginalized groups were not represented, and a lot of geographic areas, et cetera, were not represented. And so what I'm seeing today, the change that I've seen happen, is that the major dialogue isn't happening at government-run fora. It's not, it's not happening in the United States. I've been to 3 regional conferences this year, one in Bosnia for the Balkans, one in Zambia that was a Pan-African conference, and one in Lebanon, which was a Middle East, North Africa conference, let's say, that also had many internationals. And at all of these events, the discussions that were being had were really advancing the dialogue even from some of the conversations that I'm part of in the US. And so the people, I think what I'm trying to say here is that the people who are most impacted by some of these decisions are often the ones who have the most innovative ideas. And so, yes, of course, while I'm struggling to answer some of the questions, I know people who could answer them far better than I could because they've been more impacted by them directly. And so we have to listen to those voices. And that's where I'm optimistic, is that we are doing that now, that companies are increasingly listening to a range of global voices. And that was not always the case.
Right. Yeah. They're reaching billions of people, and now they should listen to those people, not just to a few people in Silicon Valley.
Exactly. And if I can just give, one small example without saying what it is really, there was a situation a couple of years ago that brought a group of people from a generally marginalized generally marginalized region of the world into dialogue with Facebook. And that dialogue has been ongoing for a couple of years now around the specific topic that they came together on. That wouldn't have happened a few years ago. This is kind of a new era when it comes to platforms being more responsive. Of course, I think it remains to be seen with all of these layoffs if that's still something that they're willing and capable to do. But I was happy to see it happen.
Great. Then we meet in 10 years and see what happens.
Yes, we need metrics.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.